to our podcast. This is another recorded episode of Stay Classy San Diego, with video production and studio provided by MaxLux Media, sponsored by Dorada Nutrition, with your host being myself, Steve Wire, a freelance reporter. This podcast is dedicated to fostering quality dialogue surrounding all things local policy related in North County, San Diego. Join us weekly as we interview political leaders, analysts, professionals, and community members on issues ranging from homelessness to housing density to elections. So thanks so much for both of you for coming on today. Really excited for this episode. Linda, this is your second time on the podcast. You came back with us, I think, in November of last year, around election time. Gary, really appreciate your time. This is your first time coming onto the podcast. So without further ado, I want to introduce you both. So Linda Mimms is an advocate for reform in public policy, law, insurance, and treatment protocols for serious neurodevelopmental brain disorders. She's the founder of the Fund for Serious Mental Illness Advocacy Internships. She's dedicated to educating students about brain diseases and criminalization and building solutions for better medical treatment access. She's also a member of the California Advocates for Treatment, Hope Street Coalition, National Alliance on Mental Illness, as well as other organizations. She holds an MA in Public Policy from Duke University, a BA in Anthropology from Lawrence University, and we're really happy to have her on the program today. Gary is a writer for the San Diego Union-Tribune. He has covered a variety of beats since 1989 and now covers the cities of San Marcos and Vista and homeless issues at the Union-Tribune. He's been a San Diego resident since the 1970s and earned a journalism degree from San Diego State University and has won numerous awards for his work. Any further credentials that either you would like to add to that, or are we?
Yeah, you can add retired.
Retired. Okay, retired.
Or not quite.
Well,
momentarily retired.
Momentarily retired.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations.
One of the reporters who took a buyout at the paper.
Okay.
And I just like to add that I'm the vice chair of the National Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance.
Yeah, that is one thing I forgot to mention. And that is a huge part of the reason why we wanted to bring you on today, Linda, is because of the intersection between the areas of mental health and homelessness. It's something that we focus on a lot on this podcast, that we've done a lot of conversation about, and it's something that we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, I want to get into some of the questions that I had for both of you. So first of all, with some recent numbers that came out on homelessness, the Regional Task Force on Homelessness released a report in the last couple of months showing about at least a conservative estimate of about 14% rise in homelessness countywide this year, and with an additional number of 15,327 people who are seeking homelessness services for the first time over the past year, which outpaces the close to 12,000 people who moved into housing. So with both of these statistics of this rise in homelessness and the fact that demand is outpacing the services that currently existing, Linda, I will sort of want to get your reaction to these numbers and sort of like what this means for our county and for our existing services.
Well, I think, as Gary will tell you, homelessness is a very complex issue, but the fact that we are pouring billions of dollars into it and we're not seeing the results that we would like to see, obviously we want to see results much quicker. And we want our homeless brothers and sisters to be able to have shelter, to be able to start on some kind of a path of recovery. Well, I'm speaking for those that suffer from serious mental illness, serious brain diseases, and or addictions. And so it's pretty distressing to see all this money coming in and then seeing our inability as a county to be able to provide shelter for people who are coming in faster than we can basically put our finger in the dike. And a lot of that I know, and Gary can discuss this better than I can, a lot of that is due to the loss of their housing. And it could be just a question of getting a slight, boost from the government to make their rent, especially with the number of people over 55 coming in at it looks like a greater rate than ever before. We need data. We need more data. Who is coming in? Why? What can we do at that point when they transition from having shelter to not having shelter? So sure. I'll pass it back to Gary.
Yeah. So Gary, your reaction to the RTFH report about homelessness, the 14% increase over the past year, and like sort of what that tells us about the current like approach and policy initiatives from the county standpoint.
Yeah, just want to say Linda is absolutely right about everything that she said, and it's a very broad thing to bring up to address just what that report means. But there's a lot of data that comes in. There's an annual report that the Regional Task Force on the Homeless does. It's mandated by HUD. It did show a 14% increase in homelessness. But what's frustrating about that is that there were hundreds of people who were in areas that weren't counted before, and that was in Caltrans property that they couldn't access before. So this number was kind of distorted. That was higher than it would have been. And that made it kind of complex to report. But I mentioned earlier in high in the story that I did this year that it doesn't necessarily mean that there was like a 14% increase. I forgot what the actual increase was without it, but that's how confusing the numbers can be. Another very interesting thing about the numbers this year that I found was that I looked at the number of unhoused people, and right now it looks really bad, right? There's a lot of big encampments everywhere that we see on bridges and downtown. But I went back like over 10 years and I saw the number of people who were unhoused, meaning that unsheltered, rather, who were not in shelters on the street, had been even higher than before. So the perception of people out is greater. And that could just be because they weren't doing as much sweeps as they did before, that they weren't clearing sidewalks downtown like they used to. I remember under Faulkner, they did abide more by the curfew, which was that you had to have your tents down by 5:30 in the morning, and now they seem to be up all day, and they just kind of got entrenched. So it looked like there was a lot more tents that were up. Well, there were a lot more tents that were up, but so visually it did look worse. But there's also another monthly report that comes out from the Regional Task Force on Homelessness, and that shows how many people were housed this last month and how many people became homeless, though. And the number of people who became homeless, over a 12-month period, when they first released this back in October, it was like 13 to 10, for every 10 people who became housed, 13 people became homeless. It was something like that. I can't remember, but it doesn't matter because almost every month there has been more people becoming homeless than people who are housed. One exception was around the time that St. Teresa of Calcutta Via opened downtown. That's a huge housing development that Father Joe's did. Suddenly there was more people who were housed than became homeless. But then it's back to the same trend as before. And I think what that really tells us is that what we're not addressing is upstream. It's like, and you're dealing with a crisis that you see in front of you, not the one that's coming down the road. You're seeing all of these people who are on the street. More people are dying than ever on the street. You're trying to deal with that crisis, but I don't think there's enough attention on trying to prevent homelessness. And Linda just mentioned that, though, that a few $100s more can keep somebody in their house, which is a lot cheaper than putting them in a shelter or dealing with paramedics who have to rush out and help somebody on the street. The county started a pilot program just this year after a Serving Seniors study found that additional $300 a month would keep seniors in their house, and that's a growing population of homelessness. Mm-hmm. So that's with all the talk we have about shelters and about encampments and cost of housing. It's like one thing I don't think we are paying enough attention to is prevention, sure. Homeless prevention. In fact, I've talked to some homeless service providers who were running out of money at the end of last year, and guess where they made their cuts? They cut homeless prevention, and they knew that is like penny wise and pound foolish. That they're you're going to pay for it down the road. Sure. There's going to be more homeless people to deal with.
Yeah. So one question I have is so both of you brought up the issue of funding, of this idea that, like just a few $100s more, for instance, for a senior citizen could, keep that person out of homelessness, that, you have underfunded programs across the county level. But Gary, you actually wrote an article back in July that said that homelessness spending countywide has topped $2 billion over the last 7 years. Or I think it was, the exact number was $2.37 billion received by local governments between 2015 and 2022, according to a report by San Diego taxpayers group. So over $2 billion, it seems like a lot of money that we're investing into this problem. What's the disconnect between programs being underfunded, the dollars not reaching people, and how much money we're actually spending at the sort of macro level?
So the Taxpayers Association is working on a program where they are assessing how money is spent, and they're not done with that yet. But the idea it's a subgroup of the Taxpayers Association, like their educational group, I think. So what they're studying is how is the money spent, though, and what and it's a very complicated thing to look at, because how do you gauge success? So one of the things that they've been working on for months is trying to determine, how do you gauge success? Is it, what is the outcome of somebody who, is in a shelter? How many people actually successfully move on to permanent housing? They've been working with service providers to come up with that too. So this is an ongoing process. The last thing that they reported on was what the dollar amount was, and they're not going to make recommendations, say here's where you should be putting your money if you're a philanthropist or a city funding funding service providers, but here's what we have found where the money's going. So they're not. So I don't have an answer for that, but I can tell you that I wasn't that surprised about the money, though. The amount of money, it's always been very high. It has been very, very high for quite some time. It's an expensive process, and we still see a lot of homeless people. And I do say that, don't complain about the amount of money that's being spent and then say it's like there's been no progress, because that's really not true. That there has been progress. There's, imagine how bad it would be if we did nothing and spent no money. I mean, it's a total misconception, but some people think, oh, we're just enabling homeless people. They spend any money on it and they enjoy being homeless, and they'll keep, living on the street. And, that's not true. I've never met a homeless person who doesn't want to be housed. The situation could be a lot worse. There are, many, many success stories about people overcoming homelessness,
Sure.
Going into rehab, getting housed, though. It's not like all that money has been wasted.
No.
It has been used, and there's a lot of success. There's a lot of streamlining that they could do. We could use more volunteers doing outreach, and the rescue mission has started a program doing that with one-on-one outreach with people. Lucky Duck is expanding that program with, so I think that's encouraging to just have more outreach too. And I think we just need to do more of everything, though. We know everything that works. We know what best practices are, but there's just so much more that has to be done.
Linda, my question for you is similar to my question to Gary, which is, we're spending more money than ever on the homelessness issue. As Gary's article points out, $2.37 billion over the last 7 years that we've poured in at a county level into the problem, and the problem keeps getting worse and worse. So Gary's answer, and sorry, Gary, if I'm butchering your assessment of the situation, but basically what I gathered from you is that, the solution isn't to reduce spending, to slow down our spending, but actually continue to pour money into these programs, and we actually need to do more. But Linda, do you agree with Gary's assessment? I mean, is the answer just more money, or is there a more systematic issue in the way that we're spending this money that has to be addressed?
I think that it's such a huge problem. It's so multifaceted that we do need to really take a look at where all the money's going, where it's going, and take account of which programs are working most effectively to get our unhoused brothers and sisters into shelter. And I agree with Gary. I mean, you don't want to cut the money off, but I think that the taxpayers want to see, okay, we want to see, we put money here, this is what's happening. Money here, this is what's happening. It's program analysis, basically. But I would like to speak to the segment of the homeless population that suffer from untreated psychosis and or addictions. And that's where we do have tools in the county that could help avert those people entering into homelessness before it ever happens. And we do not use those tools to their advantage. And one of those tools is AOT. The way we adjudicate the assisted outpatient treatment program in San Diego County is a complete failure. And I say that from all the parents who have called me, all the parents whose very psychotic, sick individuals have been dropped from the program. And then many of them disappear or they're on the streets. I try to help their parents. Nobody is listening because they are not using the protocols that were inherent in Laura's law. The targeted population were the sickest people with like schizophrenia and psychosis spectrum disorders, brain diseases, who don't recognize they're ill and will never, therefore, volunteer for services. But the way that that's adjudicated through the IHOT, in-home outpatient treatment team, they are then trying to get the person to voluntarily accept services. No, that is a terrible model. And it's not as if they have not been contacted by families, advocates, et cetera. It's not as if the Board of Supervisors has not been contacted. It's not as if the behavioral health director hasn't been contacted. They just ignore it. And that could divert people into treatment before they ever, that's an upstream program, before they deteriorate so badly that they end up on the streets. So there are some tools in the toolbox that our county is not using for that population.
Sure. And I want to address not necessarily disagreement between the two of you, but more of like this, like two different perspectives that I'm hearing. One is, Gary, you made a point earlier that you sort of believe that no one really is going to refuse housing services when offered them, or that hasn't been from your experience and from your reporting, that your assessment is that most, if not all, people will accept services when offered. But I've spoken, for instance, with the mayor of Vista, who says that in his city, they've actually done surveys of homeless people, and there are a large contingent of the population that actually do refuse services, and these people tend to be drug addicted. They tend to be, suffering from a brain disorder of some kind, whether it's schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or something along those lines. So my question is sort of just, and either of you can take this one, but how do you address the significant number of people who seemingly are unable to acknowledge that they actually need services, that they need help, and how do we sort of get these people sort of back into the system, back into these programs, as it were, when they're sort of being left out of the whole picture? Like how do we address like people who simply are incapable of recognizing that they need help?
That is a huge question, because we have an issue in our state, an ideological issue, where we have groups, disabilities groups, that fight tooth and nail to keep people from compassionate treatment, people that have lost their decision-making capacity and cannot make rational decisions about their health care and what they need to live and survive. And this is a medical issue, but it's been conflated into a political issue of civil rights. Well, that is just that's not taking us where we need to be to help these poor people that don't even know they're ill. So, Gary, you take it from there.
Yeah, Gary, what's your reaction to Linda's comments?
I don't disagree with Linda at all, actually. There are people who, I think the most heartbreaking thing is talking to family members who have somebody on this who is homeless, and will not acknowledge their own mental issues, though, and it's just so frustrating for the families, and there's nothing that they can do. It's like they've got to wait till that person is a danger to themselves or others to be taken into custody. But otherwise, it's like there's treatment that could help these people, and they won't. And there's a big gap of trying to get those people into treatment when there's not a vehicle to force treatment, to mandate treatment. But I'm a reporter. I'm not an activist, so I don't take a side on this. But I know both sides on it. And the other side is, I know people who say it's like we just got to keep trying, though, because mandating treatment is, it's not going to work unless somebody really does invest in it themselves and say, I'm ready to it. And I get that too. But I also know stories about people who got arrested and got incarcerated, and that's where they got the treatment, though. So it, mandated treatment does has its own success stories. And of course, working with someone until they come around, I've seen that success story too. I've seen people who, were addicted and schizophrenic, and one day they just accepted help, though. So I've seen both sides of it.
Yeah,
I just want to add. I want to add to what Gary said. So here's the problem. When you're in untreated psychosis, it's an urgent medical condition. It needs immediate treatment to stop brain damage, because the longer a person is in untreated psychosis, the more brain damage occurs, and that increases disability, and it decreases the chances of a robust recovery, because these illnesses are treatable. Recovery is possible. Letting people get so ill, as Gary was describing, and then, not being able to intervene to get them into life-saving treatment is wrong. It's morally wrong. And we need to really take a look at that. And we'll talk later about SB 43, which is a bill that Susan Talantes Eggman, Senator Susan Talantes Eggman, is now going through the end of the assembly process. And that is to expand, modernize the definition of grave disability, so more people can get more people upstream who are sick like that, what Gary described, into treatment, into conservatorship if necessary, to stop the brain degeneration and get them on a path to recovery.
Sure. Hey there, San Diego. If you're on the hunt for a way to enhance your health, I have a great recommendation for you. Dorado Nutrition is a company that's all about helping people live their best lives through top-notch American-made supplements. Their expert team has crafted products to support a variety of health needs, from weight management to muscle building and more. And with ingredients like Vodosia agrestis and Tonkat Ali, praised by a well-known neurobiologist seen on the Joe Rogan podcast, these supplements could be just what you need to reach your health goals. And for a limited time, you can get 25% off your purchase by using promo code SD2023 at checkout. So if you're looking for a way to improve your health, Dorado Nutrition might just be the solution you need.
And we've sort of been dancing around a more underlying issue over the course of the conversation that I want to address directly, which is, and I say this on the podcast all the time when we talk about homelessness, but sort of these two schools of thought about the homeless issue, that of the housing first approach that seems to have been the mindset of lawmakers in California for some decades now, that approach that, if you focus on housing first, then homelessness will sort of, that is sort of the way to reduce the problem. That's the way to mitigate the problem, is to focus first on getting people in housing before treating other conditions, versus the school of thought that says, we have these underlying issues about substance abuse, of mental illness, people who suffer from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective, et cetera, and that these conditions have to be treated before we can ever even think about housing these people, before we can actually get these people into help and getting them to a point where they can actually accept help and be reintegrated into society, as it were. So, Gary, you wrote an interesting article back in July titled, "Is the Housing First Model Helping to End Homelessness, or Does It Enable Drug Users?" And you talked about how the policy has become very political, but you pointed to some examples locally of how the policy might have some merit. You quoted Luke Bergman, the director of the County Behavioral Health Services Department, who said that seeing the prevalence of addiction among our homeless population, seeing the prevalence of mental illness among our homeless population should not be confused with seeing the cause of homelessness. In a preponderance of cases, homelessness is not caused by behavioral health. We know that. It's caused by a lack of housing options. Now, many people who I've brought onto this podcast would actually disagree with that assessment. There's people who have come onto this podcast, including, as I talked about, the mayor of Vista and the leader of several other cities, who say that from their experience on the ground, from actually dealing with this issue, that you can't even think about housing people who suffer from addiction, who suffer from these conditions, because they're simply incapable of accepting and receiving help. So I wanted to just kind of address this sort of, debate, as it were, and either of you can take this one, but sort of the housing first approach statewide and in San Diego County specifically. Like, is it premature to say that this policy has failed? And if so, how much longer do we give that approach before we kind of move in the other direction?
There's no evidence that it's failed. There's not. There's and this isn't statewide; it's federal, and it is and it's been in place through Republican and Democratic administrations. And it just seems a new misconception about it. And I've seen an article that said that it's failed because it had this lofty claim that it was going to solve homelessness. It never claimed that it was going to solve homelessness. And you can't convince me that housing people somehow created more homeless people. All Housing First did was a different strategy about what it takes to get housing. It didn't create more housing. It didn't take away housing, though. It was and there's total agreement, too, that people who are addicted or have other issues, they should receive treatment. The only issue is should that be required before they're given housing, though. But the idea is that they will be more successful if they get a stable life in an environment away from the street, away from the drugs. And anyone who knows about AA knows that the principle is just be away from the people that are, bad influences on you, though. So take someone off the street, put them into housing. They will have a better chance. Statistically, this has been shown that they do have a better chance of going into recovery. It's like, so what's your option? It's like, well, let's just leave the guy on the street and maybe he'll die or maybe he'll figure it out. But the point of Housing First, remember, isn't to just solve everyone's addiction. It's to solve homelessness. So you've got a guy that is homeless on the street and he's an addict. And then you put him in a house, some kind of housing, and he's still addicted, but he's no longer homeless. That's the point of trying to solve homelessness. It's like, yeah, would you rather have that guy still on the street or off the street? He's no longer in front of your storefront, in front of your house, in the park. He has a house now, and now he might be able to be more receptive to overcoming his drug use. But if he's not, he's still not homeless.
Sure.
People are overlooking that point. It's like it did get a guy off the street, and now maybe we can also get him treatment. What's the alternative? It's like just leaving him on the street to die, to be in your park, to be on your sidewalk, to be in your storefront, until he finally comes around. And then we'll put him into housing, though. So that's the disconnect, that people don't realize that we're all on the same page here. We think that it's good to end homelessness for people, and we think that it's good to get people into treatment, though. There's no disagreement there, though. But you can't just say, it's like, oh, Housing First must have caused homelessness. It must be a failure. It's like all the buildings that have ever existed that were following a Housing First policy have people in them who used to be homeless. So how is that a failure?
My question is, and I don't know if we can answer this today, but I would be interested to know, so you made the point, Gary, that you take somebody who is suffering from a mental condition, a brain disorder, or a substance abuse addiction, and you put that person in housing. There are people who would argue that that doesn't really necessarily solve the problem itself, that putting that person behind a door doesn't really solve that person's problems. But what I'd be interested to know is, like, what is the sort of recidivism rate? What I mean by that is, what is the rate at which you take somebody who suffers from a condition, you put them in housing, does that person end up homeless again? Or do they stay housed? Is there evidence that that person more times than not actually transitions to a stable lifestyle? And does that person, sort of reintegrate into society, as it were, versus that person, they're housed temporarily, but they end up back on the street? Like, I don't know if anybody here can answer that question, but sort of the recidivism rate in terms of when you take a person who suffers from psychosis, who suffers from a neural brain disorder, who suffers from addiction, you put that person in housing, do they end up back on the street more often than not, or do they end up reintegrating into society? I don't know if we can answer that.
I don't know the answer to that question, but I would like to delineate that if you put somebody into an apartment where they can close the door and they're in active psychosis, if they don't get the services right away to start helping them get out of that state, it is not going to work. It is not going to work. They're not in reality, and they cannot manage their day-to-day living. They need help. They need a supportive atmosphere. So where I don't disagree with everything Gary said, I would just say that you got to remember that somebody in psychosis, it's a state where you're not based in reality. You need those services right up front with the housing. That's my take on it.
Gary, do you have any comment about sort of the recidivism, as it were, in your reporting? Have you seen any evidence one way or the other that when you house someone who suffers from that kind of condition, whether they end up reintegrating into society or back on the street? More often than not, I would say.
I asked that question of the local models that we had, just focused on the 2 properties that they bought in 2020. And first off, Luke Bergman said it's too small of a population and too short of a time to tell, though, for a real example. But from what they've seen so far, is that there's not recidivism. People who go into these places, they stay into them. Most of the people, I think it was 12% had left. And of the 12% that left, most of them went into other permanent housing. They didn't return to homelessness, though. But Linda's also right that supportive, it's supposed to be permanent supportive housing. That there should be supports for. But I don't think that there will just automatically fall back into homelessness. But some of the criticisms that I've seen on Housing First was just saying, oh, it's not going to work if you just put people into housing and then leave them alone. It's like, yeah, I don't disagree. Some people really need some help, but the point is that they will get it and be more receptive, and it should be more successful if they have a stable environment and we know where they are every day, than trying to find people who are wandering around the street in a psychotic state. Though they should have access to support services.
I will add that it's so important for the people that are in this area, this business, to understand what psychosis is, to understand the symptoms, to understand that people can recover, but to recover, it's a chronic, lifelong brain disease. So like all other chronic conditions, there are protocols that need to be met for the highest success rate of keeping people well and able to function in society. And I think that is lacking in a lot of our approaches on how we're housing people. And it's been shown that more residential situations where there are people around, there are supporters who can help with meds, who can help get people to their appointments, that sort of thing. That's where long-term success comes in for these people.
Let me, I want to make one more point here before moving on. I think just to delineate sort of the disagreement between Housing First advocates and those who oppose Housing First, Gary, correct me if I'm wrong, it comes down to something you said earlier, which is whether people should be required to undergo treatment before entering housing services. Is that right? So basically like the idea of like, you have to, sober up, you have to receive some kind of mental health treatment before you go into housing services. Is that kind of where the disagreement ultimately is in this area of like, do we actually let people into housing even if they haven't received treatment?
True. Yeah, that's part of the disagreement. They say it's like we should require it. It's kind of like a carrot, though. You want housing, we'll give you housing, but you've got to sign on to getting some kind of treatment. And that could, like Luke Bergman said, but that could be a very, very years-long process, though a never-ending process for people with substance use issues, that they have to stick with it. It could, they may be reluctant to it, but they may come around, and it's a long process, though. So to think that, that they can flip that switch overnight and just say, okay, I'll be sober now. Thanks for the keys. And to move in, though. But the other thing is that the argument that I hear is that this isn't addressing the root cause of homelessness. And the root cause of homelessness is that they have drug addictions. The root cause of homelessness is that they don't have a home, though. There's a lot of people who are addicted to substances, and they're not homeless. They may have jobs, and they're able to deal with their addictions. So not everyone who's homeless is an addict, and not everyone who's an addict is homeless, though. So the root cause of the homelessness, again, comes down to not having a home because they can't afford a home, though. So the addiction is part of it. It's very, very related to homelessness for a lot of people, though. But if you got that guy clean, he's still going to be homeless. He's not going to suddenly have, the income to have a home, though. So it always comes down to that the root cause of homelessness is that a person doesn't have a home. And there's all these other related issues to deal with, but don't confuse, the two, or think that this is why everybody is homeless. It's not why everybody is homeless.
Sure.
I've talked to too many homeless people to know that there's no one answer.
For time's sake, I do have to move on, but Linda, I promise we'll get to SB 43, but before that, I wanted to talk about a recent policy that was passed by the city of San Diego to actually ban homeless encampments in public spaces. I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't address this at all. I sort of want to get both of your reactions to this policy. Like, do you guys see this as sort of just a sort of symbolic gesture, a Band-Aid on the real problem, or is this actually a step in the right direction? Linda, what do you think of the homeless encampment ban?
I think it's very complex territory, but I can understand the need to move the encampments away from schools and places of business. I mean, there are things going on that I haven't had personal experience with, and Gary probably has, that are dangerous to the people that are using the schools, the kids, et cetera. But on the other hand, aren't we just shuffling people around? I just recently read or saw that it looks like, of course, the data isn't all in, that people are moving maybe towards East County. So the fact that the mayors have come together and that they're looking at this as a regional problem, I think is a very good way to go about it, because it is a regional problem. If we enforce the encampment, and in my town here also has an encampment statute, moving encampments. If we enforce that, then people are they're going to move. If they don't get shelter, they're going to move around. So we need to step back, kind of pull away and look down to the whole region and figure out how we're going to do this, because just having the encampment thing is not going to
Sure.
is not really going to eliminate the homelessness.
I've also heard the complaint from several reports that actually Chula Vista, I think El Cajon, some of the cities in East County are complaining that basically the encampment ban in the city of San Diego just moves homeless people to these other cities. Gary, what's your assessment of the homeless encampment ban? Was this actually a positive step in the right direction in terms of cleaning up the streets, or does this just move the problem around and have no efficacy?
Both those things are. But I heard Mayor Wells in El Cajon say that he talked to the police chief, and they don't see that there's more homeless people there following the ban, but there are more homeless people in South Bay. The Community Through Hope said that that their pantry is seeing a lot more activity because there's more homeless people there. So, look, is a misconception about that. Everybody on the street just does not want to go into shelters, because every day many people try to get in shelters and are turned away. So the dilemma is that we don't have enough shelter beds for everybody who wants them now. So how are we going to force people or promise people that we got a shelter bed for you if you get off the sidewalk? That's why they opened up a new the safe sleeping site before they started enforcing it, and they have another one coming up. And I do know that homeless people that I've talked to on the streets, they say they don't want to go in a shelter, but I said, well, what if there's like a place where you could be in a tent and be outside and the cops wouldn't bother you and there'd be some hygiene there? Yeah, I'd go there. So that's not a bad idea to offer alternatives to shelters. Yeah, there's a lot of frustration that there's, it's unsightly, it's dangerous for some people. Business owners are just, they're filing a claim against the city now because they've lost so much, revenue from, customers who don't want to come to their businesses now, right? So, there's a feeling like something's got to be done. But to think that just enforcing it and saying you can't be here anymore because we now have shelter beds available. One, that's not true. They don't have enough shelter beds for everybody who's out. But also, some like Commercial Street looks a lot more cleaner than it did before. Where do you think those people went? They didn't go into shelters suddenly. Some did. I've read anecdotally, some people did say, I guess I will go in a shelter. And some of the people wanted to go in a shelter in the first place, but they didn't all go into shelters. They went someplace else. It's obvious, though, just number-wise, there couldn't have been every one of those people who disappeared from Commercial Street went into some kind of shelter. They went someplace else.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll just say this before moving on, that anecdotally, and this is just my experience, so I'm not making any generalization out of this, but I've been downtown a few times since the homeless encampment ban, and I don't know on what level it's being enforced, because it seems as though there's still plenty of encampments in public spaces, just from my anecdotal observation. So I don't know if the enforcement if they're sort of putting out warnings or giving people notice that this is going to be coming down. But it seems, at least to this point in time, that the enforcement hasn't been that heavy-handed for the encampment ban. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with that. Go ahead, Gary.
They also did stress, don't expect this to be overnight, though. It will take time. So you're not going to see encampments just suddenly disappear. They never said that would happen.
Sure. No, that's a good point. Again, just my anecdotal observation. So I did want to talk about a couple more things before I let you both go, which is the big thing, Linda, that you and I talk about in sort of our conversations outside of today has been SB 43 lately. And well, first of all, just for people who aren't familiar, can you sort of explain what SB 43 is and sort of the status of the bill right now as it stands today?
Yes, SB 43, and I've got my notes here so I don't misstate anything. It is going to update and modernize the involuntary treatment, the involuntary treatment requirements that are currently in the over 55-year-old Lanterman-Petrus Short Act, which is the legislation from years ago, before we knew what we know now about these illnesses being brain diseases. it's going to update that to meet medically necessary criteria. So, for instance, right now, being gravely disabled as defined in the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act is that someone is no longer able to provide for their own food, clothing, or shelter because of a mental health disorder. Now, that definition, in conjunction with a danger to self or others, is the only way to get somebody into care involuntarily in our state. And unfortunately, that definition in our own county has been defined different ways by different officials at the different times of day. So parents have been told, if your adult child is so ill that they're laying on the street with sores all over their bodies, if they can reach up to the rim of a trash can and get food out of there, they are not gravely disabled in our county. Well, that's horrible. And that has driven a lot of people into homelessness. So what Senator Eggman has proposed is she adds in unable to provide for their personal safety or necessary medical care. So that is a huge plus. And it also incorporates people with addictions now. Addictions either with a co-occurring disorder, with a mental and an addiction problem, or straight addictions. So why is that integral? Why is that change integral to the current definition? Because we can get more people into care before they deteriorate to the point of being dangerous, which is not a medical criteria, which should not even be in there, and get them the treatment that they need before they become disabled, before they become incarcerated, all of those bad things. So this could be a huge change. And right now it has had unanimous voting out of the Senate Judiciary and Health Committee's appropriations. It's gone into the Assembly and it's had, again, unanimous support out of Health and Judiciary. And now it's in appropriations and it will be heard August 14th. The Appropriations Committee will be meeting to vote on it. And advocates across our state we've been following this bill. We completely support Senator Eggman. She has a huge package of bills that are supposed to help kind of redefine, modernize what's going on right now in our state with getting these people into the medical care they need. So yeah. On that note, of course, I'm a supporter.
Gary, I want to ask you, and I know you're not supposed to take a side as a journalist, but I do want to ask, in your assessment and from the investigative reporting you've done, do you feel as though revisiting the LPS law in general, as SB 43 is trying to do and sort of alter the definition of gravely disabled, do you agree with Linda that this is sort of integral to being able to address homelessness at a statewide, at a county level, to sort of revisit this definition of what qualifies someone as gravely disabled and qualifying them for, this kind of assistance?
Oh, yeah. And I want to say Linda's my go-to person for information like this. And it's always a good idea to go back and reevaluate something that's basically a law from 1967. Do I have the year right, Linda?
Yeah, that's right. 1967, the ancient days.
Yeah. The Summer of Love. It's never a bad idea to go back and reevaluate things. Times change, though. I don't think that there should be an argument that for in any case when you're looking at a law that's old, and I think there was a lot of assumptions that was made back then that there would be, maybe we wouldn't have the big mental health hospitals, but we would have more small clinics, though, and we don't have that. We don't have as much as we should, though. So and look at the situation now. like Linda said, what gravely disabled means. It's like if you can reach up and get food out of a garbage can, then you're not gravely disabled. So there's nothing that we can do for you, though. And I mean, I see that all the time on the street, that people they in various degrees they need help, but they're dressed. They know where to get food. At what point do you say it's like this person is like we can finally do a conservatorship on them because they're about to die. And I've seen people on the street that are about to die. Though there's like one person we saw. Then the next day, photographer and I went out. It's like, oh, she's still alive. She's still here. We were that worried about her. There's I don't think there's a disagreement that we could do a better job.
Yeah.
Well, and the thing is too, just to add in here, we're not recognizing this yet in our society as brain diseases. We wouldn't do that with somebody suffering from insulin withdrawal, or any other kind of disease. And psychosis untreated is like a slow moving stroke. So are we going to leave somebody having a stroke on the street? We really need to reset how we think about these diseases. The
analogy of the part of the law that said if you had like 3 encounters over a certain period of time, then they could do mandated treatment. And Linda said, it's like, if there was a heart condition, it was like, well, after your 3rd heart attack, then we can give you some treatment.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Sure. I have a question for you, Linda. Actually, I don't know if you've done research into this, but I'm curious. So, like, it seems as though everybody here is on the same page that conservatorships are sort of a needed part of the solution to addressing the segment of the homeless population that suffers from these brain disorders. But I'm curious to know, like, sort of, as a societal level, sort of, are you seeing people's thinking on this shift? And also, a second question, I don't know if there's an answer to this right now, but do other societies in other parts of the world address conservatorships and address involuntary care differently than we do here in America, here in California, here in San Diego County? Like, is there a sort of an alternative approach that we can model our efforts after to say, these people who are suffering from these conditions, suffering from these brain disorders, suffering from all schizophrenia, bipolar, whatever it is, that we actually take them and recognize them as somebody suffering from a medical issue, as opposed to addressing it as a political question. So, Linda, is there sort of a different model for how we can think of this at a societal level?
Well, from a societal level, I do know that there's a great advocate up in Hollywood, Carrie Morrison. And she's gone to Trieste, Italy, if I'm saying that correctly, where they have a very good system for helping the people in their community that are suffering from brain diseases. And also, I've spoken to a very incredible guy, Alex Bernard. He's I think, assistant professor at New York University who has done a massive study on conservatorship in California, and also is very aware of the system in France. Now, in France, the psychiatrists look to take the hardest cases. In our country, the psychiatrists shun the hardest cases. I'm speaking in general.
Yeah.
They don't want the hard cases with people that have, schizophrenia, psychosis. And also, we have a big issue. We haven't touched on it. I'm not going to get into it, but the whole insurance structure in the United States, where most of the psychiatrists now they are not in an insurance system, so people have to pay out of pocket. Unless they're on Medi-Cal, that's a different situation. That's a whole other show. But I will say, yes, there are some better models. But you know what? We have this information. We can do so much better. And as far as the first part of your question, tremendous pushback from the disabilities rights people and ACLU in our state. And a lot of times our officials, they kowtow to these people. And I'm not saying disabilities rights are bad. I think disabilities rights groups do wonderful things. But when it comes to serious brain diseases, they are dead wrong.
Sure.
They are protecting people's rights to die on the street or in jail, and they do not understand. They're not doctors, and they don't understand psychosis, brain disease, and they keep trying to conflate it with taking civil rights away. They even filed a suit with the California Supreme Court to stop the implementation of care courts. And they have a seat at the table on the care court working group. Go figure.
I wanted to make a quick again delineation. So basically, what I'm hearing is just for people who aren't familiar with the context of what we're talking about with conservatorship. So in a conservatorship, you take somebody who does not recognize their need for treatment, and you place them in involuntary care, in a long-term psychiatric facility or short-term or however whatever is necessary for that person to get help they need. So it's an involuntary form of care that I think Linda and other advocates would agree should only be reserved for sort of the most necessary of cases, most necessary of instances, not just anybody who has a disability. But the pushback from the other side is sort of that this could be abused, that conservatorships could lead to people having their rights taken away, not being taken into these facilities without their consent. So that's sort of the concern from the other side. But Gary,
Can I just add one thing? So when people go into that kind of care, when they get better, then they take back over their own health care and they take back their lives. It's not like what these groups painted to be, like coerced, torture, etc. When they regain their thought process and their decision-making capacity, they take back control of their lives. This is not like dumping them in a dungeon. We don't have those places anymore.
Gary, what I wanted to ask you was, and thanks, Linda, for interjecting that, but I just wanted to say, do you agree with Linda's assessment that there's sort of this cultural issue at play here, which is in our culture that we're just not really recognizing people who suffer from mental illnesses, who suffer from, who are gravely disabled in this way, that we don't recognize that as a medical issue, that we're treating this as sort of a, maybe a political or a policy-making question rather than as a medical issue of urgency, as opposed to the way that we address this in other societies. She was talking about France, I believe Italy, places where we recognize this as, this is a medical issue, this needs medical treatment, and these people are, they're not capable of thinking for themselves. Is that sort of a cultural issue that you think is challenging when it comes to homelessness, or do you see it differently?
Well, it's called behavioral health, and Linda has often said that let's call it brain disorder, though, because we look at these things as behavior, as which implies that this is something you choose to do. It's just your behavior, and rather than looking at it as it's like a medical disorder, like you don't have a choice. Though there's a brain disorder. So to look at it as like a bodily function, an organ in your body, it's like you wouldn't, look at somebody with a lung disease or a heart disease as saying, oh, it's just their choice, to be that sick. And yeah, we do look at behavior as though that somebody has some kind of control over it, when often, they have no control over it. They're in another world that we're not in. So, it's true that there is a perception that they do have some kind of, that it's just a behavior, so kind of a cultural thing. Also, I think Linda should address this, but like the issue with Britney Spears, and people think of conservatorship as something that's just overbearing and it took over somebody's life who apparently looks really healthy. That's a different type of conservatorship, right, Linda? And people are
Yes, that's different. The type of conservatorships that we're talking about here are the Lantern Petrus Short LPS conservatorships, which are overseen by the state, and they're limited depending on need. So, for instance, I have a friend whose child has been on one for 20 years because he cannot make decisions and live by himself. He needs support and services. And that's not a bad thing for him. It's keeping him alive. He's having the life that he, can lead, where he enjoys life and thrives. in his place, So Gary's absolutely right. That whole thing about Britney Spears kind of denigrated and conflated that kind of conservatorship with what we're talking about, which is more a medical conservatorship.
Sure.
Yeah.
In the interest of time, there's one last issue, Linda, that you really wanted to address, and I don't want us to miss, which is the care court issue in our county, and specifically the care court program that was endorsed by Governor Newsom at the state level, how that's being implemented in our county, and sort of how that's playing out at the local level. Linda, do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. I've been contacted by many advocates that I work with all across the state. We are in the first cohort, so we are going to be implementing this October 1st. And as usual in our county, families have not been asked into the process at all. We know nothing. The advocates down here know in San Diego and across the state in the other cohorts, I think there's, I want to say 5, 6, nothing. We have not been invited to the table. And who are you going to go to when you need help to decide on how to do a program? Are you going to go to somebody who has no experience and just maybe no systems and things like that, like an engineer? Or are you going to go to people who have been working in the trenches for years trying to keep their children alive and who know the ins and outs of the system and who can be a part of the system? The care court allows parents and first responders and others to petition for the person to be accepted into the program. They also are allowed to be a help in supportive decision making if the person allows it. And I'll tell you something. Advocates are quite distressed. We've heard nothing from our behavioral health department about it at all. And also, we've been going to these trainings. The state contracted with a service who've been providing trainings for supportive decision making. This is part of the CARE Act. Unfortunately, they've taken a model that is used for people with developmental disabilities, and it's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. No, that model is not going to work for people in active psychosis. One county, Orange County, I heard an update on their implementation progress. They're using the LEAP method, which is much more appropriate. The LEAP method is by Dr. Javier Amador, and it's for people that are in psychosis and don't realize they're sick. And LEAP stands for listen, empathize, agree, and partner. So no, this model is not going to work. And we've been going to these meetings online and typing in, suggestions. So I'm very concerned. I had very high hopes to this. I wrote an editorial when this process started that was published, and I want this to work so badly. But from what I'm seeing and the people that have a seat at the table, I'm afraid of what's going to happen. I don't want to see it as another failed AOT venture. Sure. And I mean, at least this one emanates from the state and the counties are ordered to implement it. But sure. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Before we close, Gary, I want to get your thoughts on sort of care court, how it's being implemented at the county level, if in your reporting, if anything that Linda was saying sort of like resonates with your observations, or what's your take?
Oh, I'm disappointed to hear from that Linda's saying that they're just not getting a response from the county, because I do think that families and people like Linda should be more better resources for them to put this together. I have hopes for it to be successful in some people, but I also think that don't overplay it. Don't think that this is going to just clear the streets of homelessness. If it helps some people, that's going to be great. I think that there should be concerns about civil rights, so that we know that this has its own limitations. and it seems to have that. It looks to me like it was pretty well thought out in that realm. Though it's always good to have safeguards and have people giving a little pushback on something to make sure that there aren't any issues on it. But I'm hopeful for it to be a step in the right direction. I've seen like what I've called baby steps before. Like we try to do something and it doesn't do much, but it does get treatment for some people, though. But just to not to have too high expectations about it. I think that there's still a lot of work to be done.
Sure. In closing, I just want to ask both of you, I know this is a very honestly heavy topic for all of us, and so I just wanted to sort of put a positive spin on this to close, which is for people who are listening to this going, okay, great, like, this seems like an overwhelming, problem, like on such a scale that it seems like an individual person can't do a lot about it. But Linda and Gary, I want you to both think, and you can think about this for a second before you answer, but just how people listening to this podcast, people who are sort of tapped into this issue, can make a difference individually in terms of whether it's supporting a bill, whether it's petitioning for some kind of change in the law, whether it's donating to a cause. Like, is there a way that we as individuals here in San Diego County can actually make a difference at an individual level, at a communal level for this problem? How we can actually be a part of the solution, be a part of moving forward on the problem, rather than just sitting on the sidelines and complaining, arguing, et cetera. Like, what's sort of the individual takeaway from this? Linda, go ahead.
I would say there are lots of things you can do. So you can follow the bills. You can educate yourself on what's going on. You can write letters to support, asking your senator and your assembly people to support different bills, or what you find that you think would help rectify the situation that we have right now. I mean, that being politically active is not that hard. And I know that NAMI California sends out action alerts so that it's very easy to fill in, your information and then just send it off. It's not a really complicated process. Also, you can make sure that you read the news in our region, in our city, and just keep your finger on the tabs. I wish Gary was still with the San Diego Union-Tribune, because his articles were always incredibly informative. And he and others on the San Diego Union-Tribune cared enough to do an incredible 26-page report on like a day in the life of somebody trying to get services in the county. I highly recommend you go and read that if you're listening. Excellent. You will learn so much from that. So yes, there are many things that you can do. Keep yourself informed. Look where you can help. If you can go, and then down to a more granular level, if you can go down and help a shelter, serve food, do something like that, every little thing helps and can make a huge difference in your fellow human beings' lives.
Sure. Gary, any thoughts as to sort of the individual takeaway from this?
Well, first, thank you, Linda, for the show. But we have another reporter who's great, and he's been there a while, and I just talked to him yesterday. So I'm helping him with ideas and sources to continue coverage of homelessness. And people want to help, though. People, will not know what to do, and they'll go out and they'll give out sandwiches or water, and that's appreciated by the people who are on the street. Nobody is dying of starvation on the street. They are dying of other things, but there is food. But they may only get one meal a day, so people do appreciate that. If people do go out and deliver food, and there are many groups that do that. However, there are other ways of helping. You can Father Joe's is looking for volunteers all the time. They have like an auxiliary group that is full of volunteers. Rescue Mission also. Go to the Regional Task Force on Homelessness. I think it might be rtfh.org.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something on there to how to help. And once a year, also, the task force does that annual count, and it's grueling. You got to get very early in the morning. I hope I don't have to do it again next year. But they need volunteers all the time, and I've talked to volunteers, and they say it's very eye-opening because they talk to the homeless people and they find their stories, though. So that's a way of getting better informed. And connecting with some people who are already helping. And also, I mentioned something the rescue mission was doing. Was called Walk With Me, which was a volunteer program that they had where they would train volunteers to be outreach workers. And now Lucky Duck has picked it up, and I think it's called Be a Friend at those. So might go to the Lucky Duck website to learn more about it. Don't have it at the tip of my fingers, but the idea is to get volunteers who will go out. And I think this is a great idea to be like an outreach worker on a one-on-one scale with somebody and find out what do you need, and keep at it. I am very encouraged about it. Just that there can be successes. I know it's easy to get discouraged. You can point to failures and say, why is it still like this? But I've heard too many heartwarming stories about seeing people's lives turn around. I've met these people. They're housed, they're sober, they're stable. Sometimes it's because one person contacted them and helped them. And so keep that in mind. It's like I know somebody who was blind, and one guy found that he needed cataract surgery, and he helped him, and he's not blind now. So there are ways that you can help. Just do a little research, find out what's a good fit for you.
Yeah, I think it's easy to get so discouraged by this problem when you look at just the scale of what we're dealing with, and it seems like with the numbers that we talked about at the beginning, the problem's always getting worse. But it's important to remember, like the fact that when you actually step in, when people help at the granular level, as Linda was talking about, that does make a difference. That one person can make a difference, and then that's part of the reason why we're doing this, is because it's not just about complaining about the problem or arguing about the solution, but it's also about taking those practical individual steps that actually advance progress, that actually move people forward, that actually change lives. So really appreciate both of you coming on. Again, Gary Warth, formerly with the San Diego Union-Tribune, recently retired, and then we had Linda on as well. And just thank you, Linda, again. I know it's your second time coming on, so let's do it again soon. But thanks to both of you so much for coming on. Really appreciate your time.
This has been another recorded episode of Stay Classy San Diego with your host, Steve Wire. Thanks again to our sponsors, MaxLux Media at maxluxmedia.com and Dorado Nutrition at doradonutrition.com. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning into the show. See you next time. Stay classy, San Diego.